Education. This is Michael Howdes. This is through the Orthodox Christian Network. Welcome back, everybody who's joining us. We've missed a couple weeks here and there recently due to scheduling, but we're back and we're going to get right into it because we're starting a little bit late. Apologize. We had a lot going on today in our parish here at St. George, the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland. So a couple weeks ago when we were all together, we talked about this topic called unknowing ourselves. And sometimes I feel like I need to apologize. I'm not trying to be clever with words. I'm actually trying to make points or really reiterate certain points. And really the whole purpose of that discussion was just to remind us that part of our growth as human persons, part of our communion with God and each other is through the path of knowing ourselves, but then what we call ourselves, which is really, one way of simply saying it's redirecting the focus and channeling the desire for self, kind of self-focus to a pure focus on Christ, an outward focus. And the way I've heard it described and what I want to talk about a bit today is one author called it a pure ardent eros, right? Eros, one of the four loves, desire for Christ above all else, almost like a complete reorientation of our desire. Not in a consuming way, in the sense of that's all we care about, but it is in a sense all we care about because everything else we care about, our loved ones, our friends, everything is derivative of this pure desire we have for Christ. Because remember, Christ doesn't consume us; He allows us to consume Him, just like we had at the Eucharist. So that's really what it's about. A lot of times, the catalyst for this in our lives has been when. Sometimes it's just a natural desire some of us are born and blessed with, that just we see it from birth in people, but a lot of there's a catalyst often of suffering or crisis or sometimes just plain exhaustion with self-analysis, right? You get tired of yourself, but there's usually something that precipitates some precipitating event in our life, or maybe several events that drive us either back to Christ or maybe to Christ for the first time. Another way I've described it over the years sometimes is the difference between getting Christ into your life versus getting into the life of Christ. Again, nothing's wrong with the former, getting Christ into your life, but the implication there is, the focus is still on ourselves. And, my own personal experience when I had this epiphany, if you will, where that phraseology made sense to me is at some point you just like, okay, I've kind of learned intellectually everything I can learn. Well, there's something missing still. What is it? And that's when that get that transition, right? Marita's pointing to our heart, where your heart opens up. We also spoke briefly a couple of weeks ago how, self-awareness and self-analysis, which are good things to an extent, ultimately they don't lead to transformation. They don't lead to that metanoia, that joyful repentance, that change in direction. And if we stay in that kind of mode where we're very self-analytical, self-absorbed, yeah, which we can be without even realizing it, right? We may not be selfish people, but our thoughts on ourselves too much, so we're kind of self-absorbed. It's almost like we're settling for lesser versions of ourselves. We're settling for an imitation model and instead of the real thing. So we essentially have to come to unknow ourselves to become ourselves, like we're going to talk about today. We have to come to the end of our own will. And, this word eros is interesting to me because the more that I understand it, the more I see just how tragic it is that we've reduced that word to something so sensual or, erotica, or purely romantic or sexual desire, because I think it shows in some respects, kind of the societal understanding of that how far we've veered from the path or how far we've fallen, because it's such a reductionist thing. So, I want to let me just ask a question. So when you hear me talk like this, you hear this, desire of Christ and the word eros. Does it resonate with you? Does it cause any thoughts or anything you want to share?
I just want to say one thing, and that is, I have a grandchild who has just this enormous personality. She's transparent as water. She's 4 years old. And she has, when she prays, it is the most honest thing. What does she know? I really, did she come to earth trailing clouds of glory? I don't know. But this child is just incandescent in love.
Got to get her in here.
Yeah.
Oh, well, she will have everything rearranged and all the cloths rearranged too. That's her son. Now, Daddy, this is not the way we put in a barrette. Are you listening, Daddy? Poor.
Well, I mean, that childlike innocence, that childlike purity is what we lose, that we need to recover to some extent.
Yes.
And that's why it's great when we have children like that to kind of remind us of that. Because I think, to me at least, I think I don't want to knock the great gifts we have, becoming more sophisticated, learning our intellectual gifts, but sometimes there's a price to be paid by going too far, too much of something. So, hey, Andrea, we're not too far in. Yeah, Dr. Timothy Petitis, who I've quoted quite a bit this year, he says something I thought was interesting. He said, we're all governed by eros of some sort, right? For something that we might not even know what it is until we find it, but it gives order and meaning to our souls and to our lives, right? There's something we desire. Anybody agree with that or disagree? Has anybody had something they desired that once they got it, they realized this isn't maybe what I desired? Or it's became, I see many, yeah.
Like the anticipation of a trip, a vacation. I have found sometimes, I mean, it's perfect until I get there and there's no hot water.
Yeah, or even big things in life, right? There's certain milestones we put for ourselves that are, they're not necessarily bad, but we get there and it's like, is this all there is? Or this isn't what I thought it was, or
like the platonic ideal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Few things in this world are as good as you hope they're going to be.
Yeah, so there's a bit of it's sad, but there's a bit of going through a bunch of those before. I would submit, I'll throw this out there, I would think sometimes too, they're not as good as you'd hope they'd be, but sometimes realizing that helps you see the real good in them, as it leads to stepping stones for the greater good, him. I think we've all been there where we've just had something, and but sometimes we just shift our desire, right? We just keep going from thing to thing to thing. As
any good thing, even if imperfect, is still a gift from God. So it's something to be grateful for, even if it's not quite what we hoped it would be.
Yeah.
Like you get a new car and 2 weeks later you got to take it into their shop.
You figure you don't always get what you want, but you always get what you need.
Yeah, and that's really how we grow. Let me ask you about there's, I think a lot of this, we're talking about dying to self. A lot of it's dying to our own will, right? Our own willpower to be, really become the people we are. How much do you think willpower is either an asset or a hindrance to our growth in the Lord?
I think definitely an asset.
An asset. Okay.
It's definitely an asset.
I think it's got to be both.
Both.
Double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword. Okay, we're all over the place. Good. Okay, so what's your name, sir?
Harry Nick.
Harry. Okay, Harry. Welcome, Harry. Why would you say it's an asset?
Because it gives you direction.
Mm-hmm.
You have something that you want to do, and you have the makeup to stick with it to get that done, and that's the willpower. I mean, you set marks, but sometimes all you got is the marks.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So in your relationship with God and our sacramental life, you also see as an asset there too, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said double-edged sword. What did you say? Both. Okay. So you got it. Okay. Let's hear your thoughts.
Well, good theory there. I mean, it certainly can be an asset, but it can also be not an asset, because when through our self-will, it can be narcissistic and go in the opposite direction from God, like Adam and Eve did.
Mm-hmm.
So they had the will because they had the choice, and they didn't choose wisely. So free will is something that it's just that it's free, meaning we can go any one of 360 degrees with that. And God, I think, does that purposefully because he gives us the tools, but makes us choose, like Christ said, take up your cross and follow me. But, like the rich man heard that in that particular parable and thought it was too much to give up. Whereas others, like some of the disciples, did pick up the cross and follow him. So that's where, I'm not speaking for Mary, but that's where I agree with her, it's a double-edged sword, because your will can lead you to make good choices, or it can lead you to make bad choices.
I also think that if you've ever been a parent, you get into that kind of area because you see your child doing something and you know what they're doing is not necessarily the best thing for them. And then you want that control. And you have to learn to let it go. So I think that sometimes if you have willpower, you're not leaving open space for God to come in and not control, but to guide you into what he wants you to be versus what you think you should be or what you should be doing.
Wow, very good. Very
Yeah,
good.
but that you have to do that. And the way I've gotten around it is saying, I know you're not going to listen to me, but I'm discharging my responsibilities as a parent. And here's this thing. And I know you're not going to follow it, but I'm discharging my responsibility as a parent.
I understand. I've been talking to a psychiatrist about it, and it's learn when you let them fail versus if you knew they just did that one thing that they're not pushing hard enough in, they would be failing. So it's that balance of when you learn to, all right, I've told you everything I'm going to tell you. You've been given all the tools. You're either going to sink or you're going to swim versus that frustration of knowing you're not listening to me. If you would just listen to this or go do this, you wouldn't fail. So it's that fine line. And that's where I personally have the problem with the willpower.
Yeah.
I'm speaking from a personal.
Yeah, I don't think you guys, any of you contradicted each other. You think you're just talking about different aspects of something that we can use in a positive way, or it can become something that we use in a negative way, especially if we assert our will, whether it's a parent, as a person, and then other contexts where we're going against really what God would have us do, but he allows us in the freedom he's given us to, make our choices. I want to read you something briefly, and then believe it or not, this isn't the meat of the lesson, but I wanted to get us set up for it. So Robin Phillips, who's an author I read, he says that according to lab research shows we have a finite amount, any human being has a finite amount of willpower, and that if it can be depleted, right? So sometimes relying on our willpower alone as a Christian, trying to live the sacramental and ascetical life we can run out. And so he says that this is not to say it's bad, but it's good, right? It's good. It can be both, but that each one of us should work on increasing it. However, the surest way, the surest defense against temptation, against the negative things, is not willpower, but habituation, which speaks to how we approach the sacramental and ascetical life, right? Because that's all about habituation, right? The habits we cultivate for the right reasons that enable us to grow. And this is how we become fully formed persons in Christ, fully human. Sometimes you'll hear that word in Orthodox circles, although that can be a little bit misleading because we already are fully human. We're all born as full human beings. So it's not so much becoming fully human, it's just cleansing ourselves of the corruption, the sin, the stuff that keeps us from operating as full human beings. You know, like almost like we've talked about, how sin is disorder. We're almost out of order. We have to constantly be back in order. So what really, this is a setup for what I want to talk about today, and probably in a few weeks to come, is talk about what it means to be a human person and how that lines up, you know, in the way we think about individuals versus personhood. We hit on freedom. Talk about human freedom that actually results in freedom, or freedom that results in slavery. Explore that a little bit. Talk more about the role of the sacramental and ascetical life as a means of growth or lack thereof. I want to start with exploring something that probably, in a sense, seems self-evident, but when I ask you the question, you'll see why it's not, and it's worth talking about. And then there's a lot of different scholars and theologians whose work and thoughts I will be referring to, but I'm not going to refer to them every single time. But I'm just talking about Metropolitan John Zazoulis, Father John Baer, Father Stephen Freeman, Dr. Petitsis, Stephen DeYoung, other people. I just like to give credit where credit's due before I launch in. So let me ask the first question, the first provocative question. What is a human person? How would you define what it is to be a human person? This isn't a trick question. I don't have some answer up my sleeve, just so you know. But really, how would you, someone asks you, what is a human person?
Some knowledge of self.
Okay.
I think one thing that is too often forgotten is that a human person is a child of God.
Okay. Knowledge of self.
I mean,
Child
if
of
we all
God.
looked at each other as a child of God, I think that would get rid of a lot of problems that we have collectively.
Well,
Ukraine.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, ideally, right? If we all had the same basic belief about who God is, and then we treated each other accordingly, sure, there'd be a lot of healing of division and disruption and all kinds of stuff. But we don't. But what else? What else? Again, this is greater mind, far greater minds than myself have wrestled with this question. It's not an easy. I mean, you think it's not something we think about, but when you think about it, it's not so easy to. So what is?
Oftentimes, perhaps defined in the negative, not a plant.
An apophatic way of
You like chocolate chip?
that's my. Okay, now you're hitting on something I can totally agree with. Give me a chocolate chip cookie, and I'm yours. No, not right now. But thank you. Still watching my intake at the moment.
I think we're capable of reasoning
Reasoning,
and
yeah.
rational thought. Father Tim and I have this discussion a lot because he always says if you look in Genesis, the humans and animals in his mind are on the same level. And I always go back and say, but humans are capable of speech and rational thought and decision making. And he always says, well, dogs can do some, they can't speak, but they can make decisions to a certain degree. But this is just a little personal debate that we have.
Yes. No, I've heard other theologians debate about this. Go ahead, Andrea.
When I think about these questions, I try to go into the perspective of somebody who doesn't have that basis of faith.
Mm-hmm.
So if you said the living being with the id, ego, and superego working together, that biological being.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I try to rationalize how things happen in the world, we look at it from an Orthodox perspective, but so much of it isn't a Christian or Orthodox or even any type of spiritual perspective. And when I try to go scientific and just go the biological way, I try to go into a different perspective of what that human being is and why things happen in the world.
That's a great perspective to have, because you've probably found this. I know that when you study your own faith, you study other faith, you study science, you study whatever, you can see that a lot of people use different vocabulary to say some things that there's a lot more common ground than may appear on the surface. But if you're in the conversation, you don't have the ability to use their vocabulary with them, or they don't have the ability to use your vocabulary with you. You have this in some respects, a false division, but it's real because people perceive it to be real. So I think that's important, and we do need to look how people see things, because I've listened to some people that I know their worldview and their understanding of reality is way different than mine, but yet they're capable of love and reason and things that we can find common ground on, if we're not, in our case, not too high and mighty spiritual and trying to see. But I actually heard some priests talking about this the other day, so this is going to be a point in your column, just so you can is that they reminded Genesis 2:7, the only language in the creation account where somebody is created with body and soul, human beings, right? And that the experience, human beings' experience of things is very different than an animal's experience things. Sometimes harder because of our reasoning and analytical ability, right? We're very much more aware of like injuries or suffering sometimes than some scientists would say animals are. So, I guess where I'm kind of going with this, I think, let me just throw out something to think about. I think when we think about the human person, the answer lies within our understanding of God as the Holy Trinity, but also the Eucharist, what we just partook in. So anybody, any thoughts on where I'm going with that? I'm not sure I know myself, but I'm going to try.
Do we have the ability to become divine?
Yeah, that's part of it for sure. I wasn't thinking about that, but that's true.
It's funny though what you were saying about animals. Animals, I think we don't give them enough credit.
You would know. You're a vet, so yeah.
Of course, I'm a vet, so
Yeah.
I've got a different perspective maybe. But my own cat, my cat was my wife's best buddy throughout a long illness that she had. He never left her. He was always with her. He only left her to use his box and to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, he was in a bed with her. And eventually she had to be taken to the hospital, and it was COVID. And, of course, I couldn't have taken the cat to go visit her anyway, although I might have tried to smuggle him in. But we'd get on these Zoom meetings, and of course, my wife was really fond of the cat. So, she'd be on the screen, and the first thing I would hear is, "Where's Barney? I want to see Barney." And Barney I didn't have to go get him. He'd come. And he actually reached out with his paw and touched the screen.
I believe it.
I know he knew that was her. And it was kind of funny because he and I really supported each other through all this. He eventually passed away. But I like to think of him as my support cat, and I was his support human. And that cat and I are thicker than fleas. I mean, we're best buddies. But that animal has a capacity to love that I've actually seen in few people.
Well, that actually, the debate, the one I listened to that I was referring to, they weren't saying that the animals don't have that capacity, just like your 4-year-old grandchild, kind of an innocent, desire. What they were saying was that animal probably isn't processing like we do in a reasoning, rational way, as opposed to just acting very instinctively. And I don't mean that in a diminished way, but just a very innocent, just reaction without thinking, just loving without thinking, right? And there's something to be said for that. That's what they were really saying, more than
It's sort of like a 4-year-old kid that can't talk.
Exactly.
So
our
some people who've had 4-year-old kids wish they couldn't talk.
So our reasoning and our analytical, all that stuff can either help us grow more like that, or can take us away, because we can talk ourselves out of maybe loving when we should love, things like that. Marie, your hands up.
No, I was just saying, yes, got a little peace and quiet with perfect silence for a 4-year-old, but I thought.
We all want to be hesychists, right?
Although I'm trying to learn to talk cat, because my cat tries to talk to me. I mean, he just.
I'm still struggling with one language. The reason, okay, so the reason I said, like, let's start with the Holy Trinity. So what the Holy Trinity, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? One God, three persons. God within himself is a relational community, right? God, he's not an individual by himself. He within himself. He's a perfect relational. Three persons is I think, I don't know if Metropolitan Callisto is where originated this, or he's quoting Holy Father, but he said, three persons dwelling in a movement of divine love, right? So, but it's we understand God communally, and that wasn't just something that the Christians made up in the New Testament. That goes back to the Old Testament. There was a lot of revisionist Judaism, post-Christianity, but original Judaism at least understood God as like big Yahweh and little Yahweh, big. So there was a duality there at least. But my point being, and then the Eucharist, what are we doing? We confess as one mind, one body, one person, if you will, receiving Christ together. So there's a very communal aspect to human personhood. Where I was going is very relational. So however we define what it is to be a human being, a human person, we have to talk in the context of relational, right? Communal. It's not individualistic, or is it? Again, I'm not trying to be tricky here. I'm just trying to get a dialogue with how we can process and think about this. So when you think about person versus individual, is there any difference in how you process those terms and what they mean?
I think individual is like your personality, your interest,
Mm-hmm.
but personhood is more like
Existence.
right. Like,
Shared, yeah, that's right. I think
We're all many things, really, if you stop and think about it. I mean, we all have individual personalities, and yet, like today, we all came together to worship communally
mhm.
because we have beliefs in common. And, sort of, you think of the Trinity, and yet God is these three things, and yet, in some sense, many of us are at least three things. Like, I could have been described as, Bob the vet, Bob the husband, and Bob the Christian. And probably some other people might have said Bob the south end of a northbound horse. But
If you can't figure it out, I'll leave it to you. This is a family show. So.
But we're all many things.
Well, within the Christian context, to feed off of that, after, for us in the Orthodox faith, after we've been baptized and been given the Spirit, there becomes that duality that you were talking about, that we have our personhood, but we also have then, and I guess maybe you have it before baptism. I'm not smart enough to figure this one out. You have your soul. So even
You do.
in the personhood, you still have at least a dual, more than just one.
Well, the reason I said you do is not because I'm smarter than you, just because in Genesis 2:7 it says, we're created body and soul together, and then we're graced with the Holy Spirit. So body, soul, and
Well, then, and that way we're much akin to the Holy Trinity, because if you go, once you receive the Spirit, once you, were baptized and chrismated, then, we are godlike in that sense. I know listening here, wasn't living here at the time, but it's a time when I think the parish didn't have a priest who was in transition, and we were baptizing my son, so we imported the then Father Mark Airy, who was up in Frederick at St. Peter and Paul. And I remember the sermon he gave afterwards was like, after you're baptized, immediately right thereafter, you're perfect. You're absolutely perfect. But thinking about it in the context of this particular lesson, we also have, I guess, that Trinity within, with that Trinity within us.
Mhm.
So that's how I would define personhood, because I think you have to do it that way.
And I'm sure Father Mark at the time meant perfect as in like the Greek word teleos, complete,
Yes.
right? So we're complete. And then, of course, we've talked about it many times over the year here, the repentance is a continuation of our baptism. So we maintain our completeness in Christ, whose grace and mercy, even though we still mess up, through his grace, we're still complete if we continue in the, we talked earlier about the habituation of the sacramental life. Let me say something else. So let's think about this. So I think everybody in this room is married or been married, right? Harry, you been married?
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody's been. This is a loaded question, sir. But don't anybody be a wise guy. So are you, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Who are you without Maria? John, Angela, who are you without each other? Mary and I. Think about it. Think about our marriages, right? Go ahead.
You beat me to the punch. I was there 5 minutes ago. I should have raised my hand because I was having a conversation earlier today in the narthex. We were talking about why do people get married? And the run-of-the-mill answer is, you fall in love with somebody, you want to have kids and the like. But the real reason that we get married is to help one another achieve salvation. Now, I can't speak for Angela, but I've said in this class when she's not been here that she's helped me think more about how I achieve salvation. And I'm wondering, Michael, to what extent when you're opening up the conversation in the direction of marriage, that what is it to be a human person? And what's communal and relational about individuals acting as persons? It's that we're all here ideally to help each other become closer to God, to embark on that pathway, that journey to love God as much as God loves us.
Absolutely. And marriage is one way.
Yeah,
But I know
exactly.
one thing I always like to be sensitive to, because marriage gets so much discussion in Christian circles. Marriage has no advantage over singleness or any other thing. There's always paths to salvation, right? It's just that. So it's an easy way to dialogue about how at least two can help each other become one in Christ, right? But it's not if you're not married or if you don't have children. If you're married, don't have none of that lessens you or keeps you separate in any lesser degree with Christ. I say that a lot because you'd be surprised sometimes, the sensitivity there for people who get left out of the dialogue just because of where focus is. But we're really, I joke sometimes because, I read, the type of stuff I read and those books I read, like Lord of the Rings, they always introduce themselves like, I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Or, I never go around saying I am Michael, son of George, of the clan Haldus, of Keflin. My identity isn't wrapped up in that. I'm just saying I'm Michael. I didn't even say I'm Michael, husband of Mary. But that's how. Think about it. Most of us, not that we may think this in our souls or hearts, but we do operate in many ways in an individual way, even if the underpinning of our lives is very communal. There's still, at least in the ethos of this country, there's still a big focus on individualism, on rugged individualism, which has its good parts and its bad parts, but some of it can result in a diminishing of personhood. And I think I would argue that we see some of that in today's society. I don't know if there's anything new. It's just manifesting in a different way, but it's always the challenge, right? Go ahead.
I think it's actually very new. And I think it's very American, and maybe it's very 20th and 21st century Western. Because even when I would go to Greece as a young boy with my family, everywhere I was introduced to, I was Elias' son, or Fotini's son. Like I was the son of. And think about all the names that have been passed down over the years. Johnson, Peterson, Papadopoulos, whatever the Russian names are. These are all derivatives of son of, or daughter of, or child of somebody. And that's how we defined our humanity for most of the history of humanity.
We did. We would define it, but we'd also slaughter tribes because they're all part of one tribe.
Correct.
So
I'm not saying it's all sunshine, but to your point, but you're right. And I think I'm understanding now, just in these 45 minutes, what you're driving at. And I think, as Vitetta mentioned this before, individuals, islands, basically, and persons, how we all deal with one another, for good or for bad.
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But we definitely are formed by where we come from, and we try to deny that here because we're always forging new identities here, right? And again, there's the good side and the bad side. The good side is it's opportunity. I can leave my tribe and go start a brand new future for myself.
I can tribe hop until I find the chair, just like I can church hop,
But
right?
it's like so many of the topics that you bring up. I think it was Mary's comment about the double-edged sword.
Oh.
So it's fascinating, and it all depends on what pathway we take. Right? It goes back to your original question about willpower. How do we use our willpower to open ourselves up to God in a personal relationship dimension, or is my willpower to be John Sitalides, the individual, and everything revolves around me?
Yeah, and it's like, Genesis, God lays the foundation, and everything he created was good. So everything's good except what we make bad, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. So it's like, that's why in this room or in any other Orthodox circle, we're always going to talk about things from both sides, not to be maddening, but just to explore that, because things are both simple and complex at once. I think it was Father Thomas Hopko always said, orthodoxy is paradoxy, right? You have to understand and embrace paradox to begin to understand the faith, and it gets sometimes just hurts your head. Just tell me the rules, right? We all want to be that way. Just tell me what to do. Exactly. That's a flawed premise to begin with, right? I'm going to another religion. I want rules, right? I don't want guidelines or things that are so esoteric I can't master. I need a fool like this to sit here at a table and try to tell us. It's a
bring that up in the marriage context, because really what this is all about is
I like
the
what you
relational
said about
aspect.
getting
Because it's a
married
relationship
to
with God, with Christ, with the
help
Spirit,
each other achieve salvation.
and how we
When I got married, I didn't realize that was what was going to happen.
I don't think most of us
I
do.
wasn't much of a Christian when I
Ditto,
got married.
I didn't meet Mary
But
and
I
say, "You're going to help me
married a
achieve salvation. Let's
Christian
get married."
And seeing the Holy Spirit ganged up on me.
Yeah. I defy anybody to
Thank
say they
God.
met their spouse and said, "I see you're perfect for my salvation. Let's get together."
Oh, yeah, no, wow.
Yeah.
They'll take it.
We kind of luck out, right?
It could be another good line at the bottom.
Very
Yeah.
thankful to my wife.
Again, family show. We got a guy down here. Orthodox pickup lines. Hey, you're my salvation tonight. Right?
I want you to speak. I have a comment, but
go ahead. No, please.
I'm listening to what you have to say and thinking all of us here come from different places, and many of us have lived in other places. I spent more than 20 years outside the United States, living largely first in Latin America for about 15 years. Several really ugly revolutions, very, very unpleasant. But the biggest change in my life, the greatest shock to my way of thinking, was when my husband and I and our 5-year-old moved to India. And the kind of thing that you and I and everybody at this table just talked about is not possible. You cannot go out of your caste. Well, it's more than caste. It is your definition, which you inherited.
Generationally,
You
right?
cannot-
Generation to generation, or no?
I'm sorry?
Is it generation, like more than one generation? You're
Well, it's tied up and supported by Hindu faith. Islam also has a great deal to say about that.
right. I know.
But in Hinduism, I mean, you will lose caste. You will be lost if you do certain things. And it is defining, it's supporting, and it does not allow you to change. So we are so blessed to be here where we can talk about things like this, that we changed,
Mhm.
married, you met somebody. I mean, in India, when I moved there, this was in the 70s, and things have not changed a whole lot. I'll tell you, people say to me, "Oh, you mean the caste system is still in place? Is Christianity still in place? What do we do when there's a cemetery and a road is coming through? Go around the cemetery." So we have a lot of things that are unmovable in the wider world. And I think we all have to be so grateful that we can sit around this table and talk about how we remake ourselves,
Yes.
how we refine.
I need you.
So that was just an observation.
Yeah. Can you
Just
open
an
it?
Okay.
We are so lucky for this. So,
Truly.
blessed, we are blessed.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. I think sometimes I'll focus in here on some typical where are the areas of improvement we all need, but fundamentally, like in Genesis, God said it was good. It was good. It was good. There's so much good, and Christianity has really been the biggest force for human freedoms, human equality, goodness, love, all the things. And it's a shame sometimes when we collectively, our lack of understanding of our own faith sometimes, I'm not talking about people in this room necessarily, obviously, I'm saying in general, right? The broader Christian circles where we reduce the faith to something that it's not, because I would argue to some extent what we're talking about today is a fundamental underpinning of how we understand each other, right? Understanding each other as persons. It's very important. And like I said, it's not easy to define.
While Christian faith is still the most productive, most dominant faith in America, we've lost it. We're losing it every year. It's down to like 64%, I think, of the population.
Well,
now Christian.
yeah, I would say this. I mean, I've studied that issue a lot over the years. So yeah, it's hemorrhaging believers. Although I know, some people say we used to be a Christian country. I'd argue we've never been a Christian country. And I'll say, right, we've talked about this before, but the main thing is, I don't want to touch on political debate here, but the main thing is separation of church and state. There's no separation.
That's right.
You look at Revelation, the end of there's no separation, right? So again, are there reasons for that are positive? Probably. I don't get into all that, but I'm saying fundamentally, we have to be humble and really understand that we've had certain elements of society that have been very, at least line up with Christian virtues and values. But it's so our job remains the same. Orthodoxy does a beautiful job of threading that balance between understanding aspects of society that are not great, but yet not excluding people, always trying to be the light to bring them in. And that's what we need to do. And part of that is, again, part of it gets back to this: how do we understand ourselves as persons?
God bless you.
God bless you, Stephen. One of the things that we should be very wary of as persons is this us versus them mentality. It doesn't mean there's not differences. It doesn't mean there's not, real bad things going on, but Christ himself never did an us and them. He just warned us there's going to be a time where time's up, right? You have to choose. But that time is very much, you look at the life of Christ, and he's always working for everybody's salvation with great patience and endurance and love. Sometimes we water that down into Jesus as our pal, right? We forget some of the, the tougher aspects. Matter of fact, I was listening to Father Mark Antoni, who does a show here on the Orthodox Christian Network, and he was talking about his time as a soldier in Afghanistan, where he had to do crowd control, and he said trying to move merchants from their place of business is impossible. So he said, when you think about Jesus driving out the money changers, they were running from their money boxes. So whatever Jesus was doing was violent, was scary, right? We don't think of Christ that way. So, that's good for us to remember too. We got to get our act together and make a point. Yeah. So, this whole individualism thing, I think there's two sides to it. You brought up personality. We just need to understand that, personality, the psychology, the moral, all that stuff is part of who we are. But, a human person even goes beyond that, right? The complexity of a human person is, ultimately the point is we can never really be individual. There's no such thing in a sense. We're only persons in relation to other persons. I was reading about this hermit who, now let me just say before I say this, that obviously there's special callings that people have where they live in solitude or whatever. So that's different. But for most of us, that's not our calling. But this hermit said, I went into solitude to find myself. And he said, I don't even know myself apart from other people. So sure, we all need some downtime, away from everybody. We need to be relieved of our stresses. I actually saw this reel where the doctor said, the wife, you got to get rid of your stress. And the next thing they show her front door opening and she's shoving everybody out of the house, right? But one by one, get out. It was all boys too. Just like, so we all need that a little bit, right? But we're not meant for that type of enduring solitude.
But as human beings, we're very social. That's our.
We're communal. We're communal, and we're operating at our best. We're mutually supportive communally. When we're operating at we're operating at our worst. We're tribal, and my community is going to destroy your community because you're bad and I'm good, and that kind of stuff. And so,
A question, please.
Yeah.
You made a comment about, if I think I can rephrase it or remember how you said
hopefully,
it.
I remember.
Orthodoxy is able to, we have a bigger tent. Why is that? I agree. Why is that?
I think it's because of our in-depth understanding of Christ. So I think it is. Not that we all follow it, not that it makes us better Christians than Catholic Christians or Protestant Christians, but in the understanding of who Christ is, and in the
Phronema.
the phronema, the mindset of the church as continually unchanged down through the ages, through the Holy Fathers, beyond, through our modern day theologian, whatever. It's preserved very well in the Orthodox Church for those that really choose to embrace it. And it's just a deeper understanding of Christ. And Christ didn't, when we really think about like what the gospel said. Christ was out among the tax collectors and the harlots, right?
God doesn't change.
He was trying. The tent was so broad that he was going after he was with the people. We're the biggest sins in life. Everybody always condemns in other people. It's always secular money sins for the most part, right? He was out with those people trying to help them out. The tent was that broad. So that's why I think it is. I don't know that that's the right answer, but that's why I believe.
Sometimes the understanding of things cuts across denominational lines. I used to be a Pentecostal, and the church I went to had a little placard above the entrance to what we would call the nave.
Mm-hmm.
They called it the auditorium. But what it said was Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and always.
St. Paul, yeah.
And that's what we believe. So there's even though there's a whole lot of difference between being a Pentecostal and being Orthodox, it's not as much as you might think. I would contend that the Orthodox Church perhaps could be described as the original charismatic church. In fact, an old Russian priest said that to me.
Yeah, you can make a case for that.
Long time
for sure.
ago over St. Mark's when I was at a bazaar there. But it's funny, just a couple of random thoughts as I've been hearing things. The separation of church and state that we have in this country certainly had a lot of wisdom to it, because I think we can see what's going on in Russia, where Putin has manipulated the Orthodox Church there into a force of nationalism. If you're Russian, you're Orthodox. And here's a guy who used to work for the KGB and was a great communist, which means almost by definition he was an atheist, and now he's wearing a cross on his
Morning,
chest.
Vicky.
Sometimes I wonder if it burns him sometimes. But why is it there? It's there because he thinks that that's going to galvanize the Russian people into one people. And to an extent, he's right. It is, because they re-embraced the church once they got an opportunity to do it. But now he's trying to use that for his own nefarious ends.
He's corrupting the church.
Yeah.
Wherever there's
And the other question I've often asked myself, for what would I be willing to die? You ever think of that? What would you be willing to die for?
Yeah, I've thought about it quite a bit.
Would you be willing to die for your country? Would you die to defend your family? Would you die for your church? Well, those are probably the three big things most of us would be willing to give up our life
Would be on the
to
checklist.
defend.
Those three things would be the only ones on the checklist.
I'm sorry.
The only things on the checklist. Those three things would be the only three things on the checklist.
Yeah. But I think the foremost one is the only family I have left is a cat. But yeah, I would.
Is he or she Orthodox?
He's an orthocat.
Orthodox.
He's an orthocat.
Yeah, look, wherever
He wanted. He knows his catechism.
one of the great
They have an Instagram account on that, by the way.
Yeah, look, one of the great failings of human beings is anything to do with power. Let's face it. The only people probably that are suited to wield power are someone that just doesn't want it. I don't know. But I would say this, there's always going to be, within the church, outside the church, there's going to be abuses and whatnot. I think, again, the point of this today is really to just, and we're going to get into this next week and beyond because there's a lot of stuff we didn't get to, which is fine. I prepared it that way because this is a very deep topic and it's worth more than just one discussion on. But the main point today is just, we just remember that us as individuals, as this person, is always in the context of others, beginning with Christ, and that's why Christ said, it's not just between as some faith traditions say between me and Jesus. It's really he's the cornerstone, but there's the rest of the building, which is us. And I would say, you brought up Pentecostal. My experience has always been that people that have been really their hearts have been touched by God, by Christ. They may use different vocabulary. But if we have ears that can hear, if we understand enough of their tradition, enough of things that they were immersed in, we can hear the similarities. We can hear the common ground. And the beauty of our Orthodox faith is most of this thought originated in the East. It doesn't make us special or better. It's just as where it came from, right? Even the Cardinal at the Vatican I've talked about before said, we look for answers, we look to the East, right? Remember? Or you weren't there. I saw you at the Finar. But again, that's not a thing of pride, right? Because we see in the history of the faithful, most of them rejected it, right? The people that were given the keys rejected it. So we have to be humble in our orthodoxy and understand we have this great gift to understand Christ in each other, but we have to put it into practice. And again, part of that putting into practice, and the big part is how we value and understand our relationships and understand our own personhood within. So with that, I will end. We'll pick up next week, and there's nothing prohibitive in the church next week, right? I know we have the elections.
Lots going on.
Lots-
We'll get the basketball tournament. Not that's going to affect this. Nice.
Okay.
Let's chat.
Okay. So I think we're having class. I don't know anymore. One week to the next. But either way, we'll be back either next week or soon. So God bless everyone. Have a wonderful week. And we will be again together soon. God bless. Take care.